Lake trout. A lake trout caught in a remote Canadian lake was once aged at nearly 70 years old, one of the oldest confirmed ages of any freshwater fish in North America. That longevity comes from a life spent almost entirely out of sight. Lake trout are the largest of all freshwater char, with a maximum recorded weight of 102 pounds, and they get there slowly, living in cold, deep lakes across northern North America, commonly at depths beyond 50 feet and sometimes well past 200. That combination of slow growth and old age makes them especially vulnerable to overfishing, since a population can take decades to recover once it's been hit hard. Biologists actually recognize three distinct forms. Alongside the widespread common lake trout, there's the Siskiyou, a noticeably fatter form that lives exclusively in the deep water of Lake Superior, and the rare Rush lake trout, found in exactly one lake on Michigan's Upper Peninsula and nowhere else on Earth. Even their spawning is unusual for a fish this size. Lake trout don't dig nests the way salmon or brook trout do. Males simply fan away silt and algae from a boulder bed with their fins and bodies, clearing just enough space for eggs to settle into the rocks. And within a single lake, populations can split into two completely different life strategies. Some stay planktivores their whole lives and stay small, while others turn fully predatory on other fish and grow into the giants the species is known for. The same species quietly running two different playbooks depending on what's available to eat.
Brook trout. It's not actually a trout, genuinely a species of char, and yet it's the official state fish of 9 different U.S. states. The brook trout is the only member of the trout and salmon family native to most of the eastern United States, and it's easy to see why it earned that honor. Dark olive-green backs marked with wandering worm-like patterns, and sides scattered with red spots ringed in pale blue, a combination biologists and anglers alike consider one of the most striking color patterns of any freshwater fish in North America. That beauty comes with fragility. Brook trout survive only in cold, clean, well-oxygenated water, which makes them a living indicator species. A thriving brook trout population is essentially a certificate of good health for an entire watershed, and a declining one is an early warning sign for everything downstream. Biologists have identified 2 genetically distinct strains, split at the New River drainage in southwestern Virginia, with the southern, speckled trout strain considerably less genetically diverse and more vulnerable to disturbance than its northern counterpart. Starting around 1850, brook trout were transplanted well outside their native range by acclimatization societies eager to establish them as a sport fish. They now swim in streams across Europe, Argentina, and beyond, sometimes as an invasive species competing with native fish. And within their native range, there are rare specialized forms: coasters that live in Lake Superior and run up tributary streams to spawn, salters that migrate out to saltwater along the Atlantic coast, and the Aurora trout, a subspecies found naturally in exactly 2 lakes in Ontario and nowhere else.
Arctic char. No other freshwater fish on the planet lives farther north. Arctic char have been found in lakes within a few hundred miles of the North Pole. It's the only species in the entire char genus with a truly circumpolar range, found in cold lakes and coastal waters stretching across Alaska, Arctic Canada, Greenland, Scandinavia, and Russia. A range shaped by the fish's unusual willingness to colonize water most other fish can't survive in. In Norway, biologists have documented Arctic char living at depths approaching 1,500 feet, and some populations remain active hunting under lake ice through the entire winter. Within a single lake, Arctic char frequently split into multiple distinct morphs, some staying near the bottom, some hunting in open water, differing in body shape, diet, and even the number of gill rakers they have, all from one interbreeding population. It's considered a live example of a species in the early stages of splitting into several. Some populations never leave freshwater their whole lives, while others are anadromous, swimming out to the ocean to feed each summer before returning to spawn. And when spawning season arrives, both types transform, developing brilliant red or orange bellies and hooked jaws in the males. They can live up to 40 years, and for Inuit communities across the Arctic, char has been a critical food source for centuries, eaten raw, dried, or cooked, in a region where few other fish species can survive at all. Dolly Varden.
This fish is named after a 19th-century fictional character known for her brightly colored dress, and for the better part of a century, biologists were fishing for a species that, across much of its range, wasn't actually there. The name Dolly Varden comes from a character in Charles Dickens' novel Barnaby Rudge, applied to the fish in the 1870s because of its vivid coloring, but the specimens that inspired that original name, caught in California's McCloud River, turned out not to be Dolly Varden at all. They were a related but separate species that wouldn't be recognized as distinct for another 100 years. True Dolly Varden, meanwhile, occupy a genuinely narrow slice of the continental United States, found naturally only in the coastal drainages of northwestern Washington, from the Canadian border down through Puget Sound and out to the Olympic Peninsula. Like every char, they carry the family's signature look, light-colored spots scattered across a dark body, the opposite pattern from a true trout. And in Alaska, biologists recognize two distinct forms of the species that differ in something as subtle as their vertebrae count. They're also closely related enough to their look-alike cousin that the two species can actually interbreed where their ranges overlap, adding one more layer to more than a century of mistaken identity.
Bull trout. For over 100 years, the fish anglers across most of the Pacific Northwest were calling Dolly Varden wasn't Dolly Varden at all. It took until 1978 for a biologist at Ohio State University to demonstrate, through careful comparative analysis, that the inland char widespread through Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and British Columbia was a genuinely distinct species, the bull trout. The name comes from its unusually large head and mouth relative to its body, a proportion striking enough that it inspired the common name almost by itself. That reclassification came too late to prevent serious decline. Bull trout populations had already been shrinking for decades due to habitat loss, warming water, and competition from introduced species, and by 1998, the species was listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act across the lower 48. Bull trout come in two very different forms: migratory individuals that roam through entire river systems, lakes, and even out to the ocean, growing significantly larger than resident bull trout that spend their whole lives in a single stream. You can tell them apart from their similar-looking cousins by their fins. Unlike brook trout, bull trout lack distinct spots on the dorsal fin, and unlike lake trout, their tail is only shallowly forked rather than deeply cut. In Alberta, where a population exists east of the Continental Divide, the bull trout holds the honor of being the province's official fish, recognition that arrived only after nearly a century of being mistaken for something else entirely. Splake. In 2025, Wisconsin's fisheries agency stopped stocking this fish into Lake Superior, not because it had failed, but because it was breeding. The splake is a deliberately engineered hybrid, the cross of a male brook trout and a female lake trout, first produced in hatcheries as far back as the 1880s and stocked widely across the Great Lakes starting in the 1960s to help fill the gap left by lake trout populations collapsing under the invasive sea lamprey. What makes the splake unusual among hybrid fish is that it's genuinely fertile. In one study of captured fish collected from Lake Superior spawning grounds, roughly 56% of captured splake were sexually mature, a rate almost unheard of in a first-generation hybrid. That fertility comes bundled with serious hybrid vigor. In controlled feeding trials, splake consistently outgrew both parent species from their very first weeks of life, one of the reasons fisheries managers found them so appealing to stock in the first place. You can pick a splake out from its parents by checking the tail. Lake trout have a deeply forked tail, brook trout have a nearly square one, and splake fall right in the middle with a moderate fork. But that same fertility eventually became the problem. Genetic testing found splake spawning directly alongside wild lake trout and brook trout on their natural spawning grounds, backcrossing with both parent species and threatening to blur the genetic identity of Lake Superior's recovering wild populations. With lake trout numbers finally rebounding after decades of restoration work, Wisconsin's decision to end Lake Superior splake stocking in 2025 marked the end of a 60-year experiment, a hybrid so successful at reproducing on its own that it eventually had to be managed like the very species it was created to replace.